On to our next presenter of the morning. Annika Mursten will be presenting the thesis, The Path to Sustainability in the U.S. Dairy Industry, Structural Changes in Cooperatives, Sustainability Practices, and Future Outlook for Dairy. The faculty advisor on this project is Sarah Soderstrom with reader Jim Adams. Annika.
Thank you so much for the intro, Shelley. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Annika Mursten, and today I'm going to be sharing my work on the path to sustainability in U.S. dairy and the analysis of structural changes and cooperatives, sustainability practices, and future outlook to dairy. And just wanted to quickly share some of my background and inspiration for the project. It was inspired by my spring break volunteering trip that I went on in March 2020. And this was through the Michigan Active Citizens Program in the Ginsburg Center. And I spent a week volunteering at Gia Nagari Eco Farm and Sanctuary. And this is the first and only USDA certified slaughter-free dairy farm in North America. So I spent a week working with the cows and the milking process and on the farm. And from this trip, I was inspired to learn about how the entire dairy industry is embracing sustainability and kind of what that practice looks like across different organizational forms. So just to start with an introduction of US dairy and what it looks like today, there's been a large shift to large farm and herd sizes, the largest we've ever seen in history. And this is driven by efficiency, focus on profitability and reaching economies of scale. There's also been a large change in consumer preferences, and this is related closely to dairy alternative products like soy and almond milk. But the greater umbrella change here is that consumers are demanding a more transparent, healthy, and sustainable product. And we've also seen a large decline in milk consumption in the US compared to 1975. There's been a 35% decrease in milk consumption. And this has also led to some volatility and increased risk for the milk markets relating to pricing and kind of affecting the entire value chain of stakeholders from the dairy farmers themselves to the retailers of milk products. And lastly, what I'm focusing on in my research is the environmental impacts of dairy production. There's so many negative environmental impacts today that dairy farmers are focusing on. And this kind of goes from greenhouse gas emissions to soil and land degradation, water use and depletion of the country's largest aquifer, as well as nutrient runoff. So those are kind of the aspects that I'm focusing on in my research. And next, just want to share some history and background of the dairy industry and why it's such a unique industry in the US and the way it's shaped. So the first aspect I want to touch on is cooperatives. They function as groups of dairy farmers who work together and they pool their milk together. And this has been going on since the early 1800s in the US. It was a tradition brought from Northern Europe and has continued to become kind of the dominating factor of the dairy industry today. And cooperative market share has continued to grow. Well, the number of cooperatives has declined because of increased consolidation and kind of that trend I touched on before of reaching economies of scale. And next, I want to touch on the aspect of pricing. This is done by the Federal Milk Marketing Orders, and this was introduced in the 1800s and continues to monitor pricing today in the US. And this arose in response to cooperatives' attempts to standardize milk prices. And essentially the way this works is that it sets milk prices into 4 categories depending on the end product, with liquid milk being the highest price, and then lower prices are for like butter and cheeses. And it sets price minimums to kind of set a standard for the farmers. And then another function of this, similar to how cooperatives work, is it pools milk sales together into 11 marketing areas in the US. And essentially, I just wanted to touch on these 2 aspects because dairy is really unique in that cooperatives are able to kind of function as monopolies without violating any antitrust laws. And the Federal Milk Marketing Orders work as a form of price discrimination in the dairy industry. So it's unlike any other industry in agriculture, or really any in the US, in that it functions really differently. And next, just want to show a quick graph showing how much milk is today part of the Federal Milk Marketing Order and kind of that government pricing system. It's 75% of all US milk, and then the rest of it is under state-specific orders. So these are just states that aren't part of any Federal Milk Marketing Order regions. And then also just want to highlight this 1% of US milk is considered to be unregulated. And this is coming from independent dairy farmers that are selling their products directly to consumers, but is overall a much smaller piece of the industry. And then next, want to show a graph here with the market value share that cooperatives have. These are the top 5 largest cooperatives in the US today, and they are dominating the industry. They produce most of the milk that we consume every day. And also just want to highlight Dairy Farmers of America is the largest co-op. In 2020, they had $11 billion in sales. And they recently acquired a different dairy producer, Dean Foods, who filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2020. So kind of through that process, they've been able to really grow their scale and how much milk and sales they're producing in the US. So just wanted to highlight this as cooperatives have historically dominated US dairy. This kind of goes from pricing, market power, and policy changes. And today they produce 81% of all volume of milk. So they really are a key part of the industry as we look forward to sustainability. So here, this is my research, what I'm focusing on. It's how do the different organizational forms of dairy engage with prioritization and innovations within sustainability. And here I'm focused on the different organizational forms as the cooperatives, publicly traded companies, as well as independent farmers that kind of make up that 1% of all milk production. So these are the methods that I go about for my research. I focus on 4 main areas to better understanding sustainability in dairy. And the first is a literature review, and this includes government organizations like the USDA and what they're publishing, as well as cooperatives and their publications, and prior research that has been conducted surrounding this. And the next was analyzing public company filings, and this includes like companies like Kraft Heinz and Danone that are actually public companies in the US. So they are legally like able to disclose more information than cooperatives, which are privately held companies because they're owned by the farmers that are part of the cooperatives. And next I focused on case studies. So I studied 3 individual dairy farms, and this kind of was to show dairy farms that are members of cooperatives versus independent dairy farms and what their sustainability practices look like, which I'll discuss more soon. And lastly, wanted to touch on Zoom interviews. I conducted Zoom interviews with industry experts in dairy, professors that are focused on this, as well as members of cooperatives, and kind of what sustainability looks like from their point of view. So next, just want to touch on some high-level takeaways that I had here, and then I'll jump into some more in-depth analysis. The first thing I learned that I thought was really interesting is that dairy farmers and the cooperatives are really understanding the environmental impact of their cows. And for the last decade, they've been really focused on increasing sustainable practices within their farms. And there's definitely been some progress already. Compared to 70 years ago, 1 gallon of milk uses 65% less water, 90% less land, and overall has a 63% smaller carbon footprint, which is definitely some great progress there. And the industry's overall focused on continuously improving and creating a more sustainable, healthy product and being more transparent with their consumers, and using fewer resources to make milk. So some of the analysis I did first was looking at what are some of the overarching goals that the US dairy industry has in mind with sustainability, and what does kind of standardization look like from that point of view. So I found through my research that being part of these coalitions and groups and having these shared goals for sustainability is something that's been really driving US dairy forward in terms of sustainability. So here I highlighted 6 of the main coalitions, and overall, the members of these include cooperatives, the public companies, as well as individual dairy farmers. And I think this does a really good job of representing how sustainability is a joint effort, kind of among all of the parties of the value chain. And one of the main ones that kind of is like an umbrella across all of this is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and kind of how agriculture and dairy kind of fits into that global blueprint for creating a more sustainable future. And this has been adopted by other frameworks and coalitions. Another one that I wanted to touch on was the Dairy Sustainability Framework. This is one that's been really adopted by the cooperatives, and it focuses on achieving sustainability in all aspects of the dairy value chain, and has extended into the Sustainable Dairy Partnership. And overall, the 2 goals, I think, of these coalitions and frameworks is one, to really assist farmers in understanding and being able to better implement sustainable practices on their farm, and then kind of taking that next step forward and communicating to the consumers that there's higher sustainability in the product, and that farmers are really passionate about including sustainability into their product and passing that forward to the consumer. And there's also state level coalitions. There's one in Michigan that I also mentioned here and learned about in my interview process as well. And this is a certification for environmental excellence. So there's some ranges in here, but I think the key thing is that there is an overarching goal, and it is like a shared joint effort by the dairy industry. And next, I want to touch on an analysis that I did on the cooperatives. So as I touched on before, the cooperatives are a really dominant part of the industry. And I did analysis on 10 of the largest cooperatives in the US. And I found that all 10 of the cooperatives are members of coalitions like the Dairy Sustainable Framework. And they all publish their own sustainability reports in-house and have sustainability teams. But I was curious in taking it one step forward and kind of learning about comparing them and seeing which cooperatives are really pushing the envelope in terms of sustainability and which ones kind of have more work to do. So I broke it down into 3 tiers, and the highest tier contains 3 of the 10 largest cooperatives. And these cooperatives were publishing in-depth sustainability reports, are very transparent, data-driven, and goal-oriented. Dairy Farmers of America is included in this tier, and they're the largest. And they are also really focused on sustainability practices. And one of my interviews was with the director of sustainability from Dairy Farmers of America. And through that, I was able to learn more about the goals that they've outlined for the next 10 years. And the middle tier is somewhere in between. They publish reports, but they have fewer historical data and goals. And I found that most of the cooperatives were in this middle tier. And the least tier, the lowest tier has the least amount of kind of published reports and outlined goals. And I found that in a lot of cases, they bucket together CSR and sustainability, while the other cooperatives tend to have those as separate focuses. But overall, I was really excited to see that the cooperatives are all members of these coalitions. They all are really focusing on sustainability going forward. And next, I want to touch on my case study analysis. So for this, I studied 3 farms, but I'm just going to include 2 for the presentation. And the first one is Swiss Lane Farms, which is a farm in Michigan. They're actually part of the Cooperative Dairy Farmers of America. And through my interviews with Swiss Lane, I was able to learn more about their sustainability practices and how they've really been able to drive forward these projects with the support of Dairy Farmers of America, as well as their director of sustainability, who I spoke with. And one of the highlights of Swiss Lanes is that they have a nonprofit education program, and they're really focused on connecting with community members and highlighting sustainability milestones that they're able to achieve. They also received the certification from the state of Michigan. And then next, I want to touch on Gita Nagari. This is where I had spent my spring break last year volunteering, and wanted to show that they're kind of on the other edge of being an extremely sustainable dairy farm. They're slaughter-free and focused on animal welfare, and they're driven by the concept of ahimsa, which is nonviolence, and environmental justice. And they have a lot of sustainability projects kind of across the entire dairy process, as they're like a vertically integrated farm, and they have kind of going all the way to the end with methane biodigestion processes. And something that I thought was interesting to touch on with them is they sell their milk gallons for $14, and they have a wait list of over 300 households that are looking to join. I think this really highlights how consumers are demanding a more sustainable product, and they're willing to kind of pay a higher price for that. And Gita Nagari is an interesting case study because it's not really feasible for the entire dairy industry to kind of adopt this business model, but I think they're kind of doing a good job of showing what sustainability could look like. And then next, I'm going to touch on some of my conclusions and takeaways and next steps from my research. I was really excited to learn that sustainability is at the forefront of the dairy industry and kind of there at all levels of the value chain. And cooperatives are actually leading this movement. And I think that's really interesting because we have a lot of reasons to maybe be skeptical of cooperatives. They function as corporations and are focused on profitability and kind of delivering as much milk as possible to the US. But once I took a deeper dive, I really learned that sustainability is something that they're focused on. And I think it's something to be hopeful about going forward. And I also saw that there was a successful implementation of goals, and this kind of goes from the Sustainable Dairy Framework and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are something that are driving and uniting the dairy industry in terms of sustainability. There's also been an increased transparency with the consumers. As I touched on before, the consumers are really looking for a more sustainable product. And this is something that dairy farmers are working on. As well as I think there's a potential expansion for more data-driven goals and a greater focus on land and soil. As I touched on in the beginning, that's one of the main environmental impacts from dairy. And I noticed that only 2 of the 10 cooperatives in their sustainability research are kind of having land and soil management and land and soil degradation as a front of mind issue. And some next steps that I think will be really interesting for the industry going forward is kind of having a need for increased standardization as globalization of the industry continues. I think this is important for cooperatives. Dairy Farmers of America has over 13,000 dairy farm members. So I think kind of standardization and what that's going to look like across all their members is going to be something really important going forward, as well as the shift from a compliance-based to an impact-based mindset. And this is something that through my interviews, I saw that the dairy farms are really kind of approaching and taking in, as it's less of compliance-based and kind of meeting the bare minimum to doing more and focusing on impact. And lastly, I just want to say a big thank you to my faculty advisor, Professor Sarah Sederstrom, my reader, Jim Adams, Professor Jason Duvall, for all the inspiration through the thesis process, and my PitE advisor, Jamie Langdon, for an amazing 4 years in the program, as well as the entire PitE department. Thank you so much for everyone who made this thesis possible. And thank you everyone for joining in today. I would love to take any questions that the audience may have.
Thank you, Annika. Really very nice job. Do we have time for a few questions? So I actually have one question, which was a purchase price of $14 per gallon is pretty steep. And I think one of the things we definitely see is with a lot of these sustainability initiatives, they drive up the price of consumer goods. And so from sort of this justice lens, there's, a lot of these sustainability issues are built on, both environmental impacts, but also improving justice in terms of broad, whether it's community justice, whether it is environmental or animal health and welfare. How do we think through, as these sustainability initiatives drive up prices, how we also keep things reasonable for consumers, so it's not just wealthy people who have access to sustainability produced goods?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Shelley. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think the $14 a gallon is something like interesting, but it's not really realistic for the entire industry. And I think it's kind of a balance for the cooperatives and the large dairy producers, because they see declining milk consumption in the US. And that's kind of being replaced in some senses by the dairy alternatives like soy and almond milks. So I think they see this as a complete necessity to adopt these in order to kind of create a product for the consumers that they're wanting to have. And then I also saw, this is something I didn't touch on a lot during the presentation, but is more in my thesis, but the publicly traded companies kind of released financials, and I was seeing that they were still able to be really profitable, and it didn't seem like the milk prices were changing that much, as a reflection as they continue to kind of adopt these sustainable practices and change the way that they're operating.
Great. No, great answer. Anybody else have a question? Well, great. Well, Annika, I see that you are actually moving to NYC soon to work in mergers and acquisitions investment banking, which is a little bit different from the milk industry. What are you most excited about with that opportunity?
Thank you, Shelley. I'm really excited to move to New York. My brother is also up in New York City. I'm really excited about the company that I'm going to start working at. So I'm really thankful for my 4 years at Michigan, but excited for my next journey in life.
Well, excellent. Well, best of luck with the move and the new job, and certainly keep us posted on how it goes.
Thank you, Shelley.
All right.